Hello, this is Josh Drumm, and here's my individual progress report. My first user story is, as a player, I want to have different game tiles so that the maps are challenging. The implementation goes as follows. Each tile type inherits from superclass tile. Each map has a set of tiles, a tile set, an array list of tiles, and all the actual map information is stored in a double array of ints. Each of those ints corresponds to an index, and the tile set array list is done this way so that we would not have to have an individual tile for each actual tile on the map. This way we could save a lot of resources. As you can see in the tile class, tile has an icon and a boolean for passable. This passable determines whether or not an actor or an object that moves in our game can move across this tile, like a floor tile. Floor tile would be passable while a wall would not be. Additionally, the tile has methods like get icon, so you can get the actual image that the game board will need for drawing later. You can get, if it's passable, you can also apply effects to base objects, so as soon as an object enters that tile, it'll apply some kind of effect. It'll do something to that object if it needs to. The next user story is, as a player, I want the game's camera to move with me as I travel around so that I know where I am going. The implementation goes like this. The camera has a reference to the player, and vice versa. The game board has a reference to the camera. The game board is responsible for drawing to the canvas, but gets information on what and where to draw from the camera. And the player and camera use a pseudo-observer pattern. So the player registers with the camera, and the camera registers with the player this way that they are able to get information from each other. And the game board has a reference. The game board has a camera and is able to figure out where the camera is and also figure out what tiles it's going to need. The camera is involved with 5 major game functions: setting up drawing information, updating the player, scrolling, recentering, and drawing. So as you can see on the top here, setting up drawing information comes from game activity, where the drawing information is passed to the game board, and then from this the game board calculates the most tiles it can draw in the X and Y direction, and it passes that to the camera. And then after that is done, the game board registers the camera with the player and the map, and the camera will save this information. So once this comes to the camera, the camera will register with the player, so now that the player will not have a reference to the camera, and then afterwards the camera will update without displacement, which that means it will center on the player without having any scrolling at all. Next is updating. So from the game activity, it calls update game objects on the game board, and what this does is it calls act on every single actor on the board. And since the player class is an actor, it will call act. So as you can see, it calls act all the way to the player. And since the player has a reference to the camera, what it does is it calls update on the camera. And what this will do is that if the player moved at all, it will notify the camera that it did so, and it will tell the camera that it needs to move to recenter on the player. Next happens with scrolling. So the game activity will notify the game board whenever the player moved, held on the screen and moved their finger around, and it will give the amount that it moved in each direction. So the game board will just simply pass this along to the camera, and the camera handles all of the scrolling between for your finger. The game board simply passes all of the information down to the camera, and the camera handles all the implementation. Next is recentering. So after you're done scrolling around, there will be a button you can hit on the screen, and it will recenter the camera on the player. So whenever this is done, game activity calls recenter to the game board, and the game board calls center on player to the camera. And what this does is it will simply just update without displacement. So all that will do is center the it'll center the camera on the player without any scrolling. Lastly is the drawing. So what happens is that when the game activity decides that it's time to draw again, it will call draw from the game board, and the game board is in charge of the drawing, but it gets all of the drawing information from the camera. So what it will do is that it will get its displacement x, which is the displacement x is the subtile between tiles. So there could be a half value because you could have scrolled a half tile. Displacement is just for if you scroll, and it deals with half tiles and subtiles. So it gets the displacement x and returns it. It gets displacement y and returns it. Then it gets the x coordinate, which is x and y are based completely on tiles, and there are no subtiles at all with this. So then it'll simply just get the x, it will get the y, and then the game board will just use all this information to be able to draw everything on the map. And that concludes my individual progress report. Thanks for watching.